I just wanted to highlight some of the areas around citizen science and citizen engagement, because for many of us working in rural development and community development, engagement is a word we use constantly, and we work with people. But I suppose in many ways that collaboration has evolved over years to the point where it is more about citizen science and co-designing and learning from each other, as opposed to coming in to do a project in a place and taking from and leaving with really good data, but not actually leaving anything positive in the background. So on the next slide, I also printed this really small, so I can't read it. On the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit about this, what I'm going to talk about today, but also the project overall. So for my own area, I've always been really interested in decision making and good evidence bases for decision making. And a lot of what happens in rural places is romanticization of the rural, idealization. There's a lot of myth building about what the rural is. And it is an incredibly political area. You know, we like to divide rural versus urban, and we like to kind of create these stories and myths about what the rural is. But for those of us working in policy on rural areas and actually trying to make decisions, or at least inform decisions, evidence is key. So this project really is about finding an accessible spatial data for rural places. So really the background of the project is that there's a perceived lack of digital data and technologies in rural areas. And this really is a challenge for countryside communities, particularly given the global push for digitalization. Obviously, the COVID-19 crisis gave us a lot of a push towards a digitalization. We talk now more about remote working and this idea that that's the future for rural areas. I've got issues with that, but that's a whole other story. And we talk about digitalization of the rural and the application of digital data. So really, the question for our project is, can the rural fully embrace digital data and digitalization? So in the next slide, just to give a bit of context about where the literature is in rural areas, you hear the language around decline and change, challenge, and those are all a reality for rural areas. But I suppose if you look at rural areas from the bottom up, the language has changed to opportunity and potential. And actually, what can we harness in localized rural areas for the long-term resilience and sustainability of those places? And for me, I would argue one of the things we have to do is have a strong evidence base so that the right decisions, or the best decisions, or the best fit decisions are made by people living in rural places and for people living in rural places. So in the next slide, I just identify some, in work package 2 for the project, we undertook, having set our literature and our conceptual framework, we undertook to interview a series of high-level experts in rural development and rural data. So you'll see there, we interviewed sort of international from OECD, Canada, and then we also went down to the local level and talked to people in local development companies, and also at national level in like the CSO and the OSI. We really wanted to explore, what does rural digitalization mean, and what data do people need? So the next few slides really outline the main findings that we have from this stage of the project. And this is preliminary, and it's just the first part of work package 2. So really the key themes we've selected are communities, data, digitalization, and definition of the rural. They're kind of the main 4 themes I'm going to talk around today. So first of all, we go on to communities. Thanks, Liz. What we found was the approach is really important. So here we have top down versus bottom up. And I think that's a central issue in citizen science, is that we really are looking at getting data from the bottom up and listening to people on the ground. What do they need? But the challenges that were identified under the theme of communities is the level of access. While people may have broadband, do they have good broadband? And do they actually, on another level, can they access the data that's actually out there? Because a lot of our interviewees who worked on the data side went, there's loads of information. You don't need any more. that was which surprised us. Yet when we spoke to people working in rural development, it was very much, yeah, it's there, but we don't know how to access it. We don't know how to make sense of it. And that tied in with kind of level of awareness. There was a sense from the rural development end of things that there wasn't an awareness of what databases were there, and also that there was a need for skills, education and training around it. So in analysing that, we can see there's an agenda around data that isn't necessarily making it very accessible for maybe individuals or communities living in rural areas, and that there is a need for capacity building and education around it. And also that if we try to at least listen to people, we can co-design potentially platforms in which people can access the information. So on the next slide, then we specifically talk about data. So some quotes here. So for some people, they thought, well, I don't think there's a real data gap. I think there is plenty of data and it's rich, it's available, and it's very good quality and data as well. So that was kind of an attitude we were getting kind of at the top level, going, it's there, all's good. Then people talked about the granularity. Okay, so we have good national level data about the geography of rural places, but actually do we have it at the right scale and granularity? And that's an issue we're definitely seeing come through. But then, as one of our other interviewees said, it's not enough to say it's available. How should it be used and what should it be used for? And the community needs to know that so they can access it properly. If the community doesn't understand those elements, just making it available won't move the needle in any way. And in ways, that's the kind of stuff we want to hear because that's what the project's about, but at least it's good to get it verified. So there is potential that if communities have access to data and it is accessible, there's an opportunity to transform decision-making and the understanding of places. Also availability. What is its use? What does the rural citizen need? And can it be accessed appropriately? And also it's important that if people do have access to data, that it's empowering for them, that they actually feel that they can influence decision-making and how it's designed as well. So in the next slide, we talk about digitalization. This was one of our controversial questions because people didn't really know what to think of it. And also in rural development at the moment, there's a lot of talk about smart villages, and there's a misunderstanding of what that is. You know, there's from one element, it's having a solar powered bin in your town, or for others, it's broadband. And there's a lot of confusion out there at the moment about what does smart, like we talk about smart cities, what does it mean in a much more dispersed kind of population sense? So here, you know, the issues that people talk about, well, can there be full digitalization? Is it about connectivity? So is it about broadband ultimately? Is it more about provision of information? And also the most engagement with public policy, it doesn't occur on a digital platform. So when people are in their day-to-day lives, they're not doing it on a digital platform. And again, training and capacity, that comes up in everywhere. So again, with some of the quotes, digitalization is good, but it should supplement and replace and not replace, because the very essence of rural is that it's a social construct. A rural community is a cluster of things. It's shops, it's businesses, it's schools, it's everything. So digitalization bucket has to have different components. And then that's another thing they can stop doing, is to start telling us what we should be doing. So everyone has been told, well, you should do this, but actually people feel a little bit like you're telling us from the outside what we should be doing in our rural communities, but we have ideas too, but how can we communicate that? And some of those quotes leads on to the next slide, which talks about the definition of the rural. Now, if anybody's familiar with rural studies, I'm a rural geographer and rural planner by background, but one of the biggest issues we always talk about in the literature is, what is rural? What actually is it? And it is that earlier quote talked about it being a social construct. But importantly, what we find in the literature and also through the interviews is that really the definition of the rural is important when it's going to have to adapt depending on what you're actually looking at. And that's something that we're trying to work on in this project as we look at rural data needs. Well, what is the rural when it comes to that? And that's when you can get sort of very philosophical about it all. But it is interesting to sort of recognize there are different types of rurals. You know, it's like the earlier talk about that binary of urban versus rural. It isn't a binary. It's very complex. We don't expect there to be one type of urban, so we shouldn't expect there to be one type of rural. And I do think that's coming through in policy more, but it's still something that we kind of need to figure out, particularly when it comes to data, because it'll be how we define places through mainly top-down data, and that's why bottom-up citizen engaged data needs to be there. So coming to the end, can the rural fully embrace digital data and digitalization? So there is potential to transform empowerment and local decision making through the use of digital data. But you must have people engaged with it. And that came out really strongly in the interviews. And it's basically an argument for citizen science. The shaping of the agenda must be a mix between the top down and bottom up. And that's a really big part of our project, in that we're now working locally in our study area in Roscommon, but because we have a national partner, the next work package will be very much looking at how do we shape it for a national audience and get it through. It must look at community needs and opportunities, I would say. Community participation and development is incredibly important, but how we look at data needs to evolve constantly. And it must be flexible and adaptable. So the next steps for us, we have a survey which is ready to be launched in Roscommon, which we'll be putting out for all residents. And that is really just trying to get an everyday sense of how people engage with local information in their area. And even that was a tricky survey to design, because there's a lot of technicalities. Dom knows all about it. And we had to go through various iterations of it. But actually it was a really good experience, because part of the IRC project is I'm a social scientist and you work with a STEM scientist, which is Ianoa. And even I'm learning so much from working with Ianoa. Hope she's learning from me too. We'll also be running workshops with user groups in the local authority and with businesses and local farmers. And we have a World Cafe event happening in September in Roscommon, where we're going to be feeding some of our findings, but getting feedback back, because a very central part of what we're doing is about that constant ongoing co-learning and engagement. So thanks very much. Thanks, Lisa.
Very good. My thanks to Liz and Jane for the invitation. Pleasure to be here at the Earth Institute. So I'm going to talk a little bit for about 10 minutes or a little more about a humanities project that we ran in collaboration with Gunther in DCU. There are co-collaborators on the Dukas project. There we are. So just very quickly, a little bit of background. Am I okay there? Yeah. The collection, the National Folklore Collection, which is in the Newman building on the ground floor, just inside the rear door, and we're open Monday to Friday. It contains the collections started by the Irish Folklore Commission in the 1930s. The Commission's job, its remit, was to record, to document, to archive, and to publish folklore material. And that covers everything from the verbal arts through to material culture, ethnology, everything from food, the natural history, and social and community issues. So it was a very slow, very labor-intensive approach. In the 1930s, from at least the late 1920s, people connected with the folklore world in Ireland and indeed in Northern Europe recognized the possibility and the advantages of involving school children in the collecting of folklore and gathering topographical information about their home place and so forth. And then this was implemented in 1937. The Irish Folklore Commission, along with the Department of Education and indeed the INTO, came up with a scheme for senior primary school pupils, that is between the ages of, we'll say, 10 and 14 years of age. And bear in mind that for the vast majority of school pupils in the 1930s and even later, didn't get secondary school education. So a great many students would have stayed on until they were 14 or indeed older in primary school, you know. So they developed, at least the Commission did, they developed an instruction manual for teachers. Getting the teachers involved was key to this whole project, absolutely vital. And the Commission were very sensible in how they approached that. They organised public meetings with the INTO and explained to teachers exactly what this would be. Limits were set on it, so it was recognised as being not an additional burden of work on teachers, but that it would be form part of the school curriculum for the school year 1937 to 38. So what subject matter were they interested in recording to the schools? And bear in mind, about 4,000 schools in what was then known as the Free State. The 26 counties took part, and upwards of 40,000 school children. So some of the subject matter concerned children and their activities. And here you can get a flavour. About 55 different headings were determined by the Commission, and giving examples. And a great many of these concern the environment. So they're topographic, many of them in nature, recording events, severe weather events, recording, you know, the use of plants, ethnobotany features very, very strongly, healing, cures, and also the verbal arts, stories, poetry, proverbs, and so forth. And here you see an example. This is typical of the, I don't know if you can all see that clearly, but each child had an exerciser jotter, and they spoke to their parents or grandparents and carefully wrote down accounts, answers to various questions that they were put. So in the top one there, Mahan Vaher Quart McGinty Hogan Taver, my grandmother, Kate McGinty, gave me this information, and she talks about old roads there. On the right hand side of the page, Livena, herbs or plants. And below, a little piece about the revolutionary years written in West Clare. Interestingly, the revolutionary years didn't figure terribly strongly. Not surprising, I suppose. There was a broad silence to some degree about the whole revolutionary years until effectively the 1960s. At the end of the school year, the essays, or at least a selection of them, were transcribed into larger notebooks by the school children. And there's about 1,100 of these, about 400,000 pages. These have been all digitized and are available on Dúchas now. You get the details of the school here in the bottom there. So this is Achill in the barony of Borrasul, and the school is Gobachura. That's actually Achill Sound. And just to give you an idea, how remote is this information from as well? This woman here on the right, she's holding the copybook she wrote back in 1937, 38. In the center there is her daughter. And then here is her daughter, and she is her daughter. So there's 4 generations involved here. So there's an important family history, community dimension to the collection. We have about 18,000 of the original copybooks. They didn't all survive, and that is a huge task. We've only digitized a portion of them, and we're hosting it on our digital platform, Dúchas.ie. This is where all of the various collections from the National Folklore Collection are being hosted. And basically, for users of the site, it's divided into, you can access material in 3 ways. I like to call it people, places, and things. So you can search under names, you can search, you can zoom in using a map to isolate information about a particular area, or we have a topics listing as well. So we're trying to introduce a control vocabulary to enable people to search more meaningfully on the site. Now, just a word about Gríos or Fionntar in DCU. We've been working with them for over 10 years now on the Dúchas project. You can see at the top there, the tabs. They are also responsible for anim.ie, the biographical database, luganim.ie. Many of you here will use that all the time, the place names database, and terma.ie, a national terminology database. So they have a lot of technical and internet skills that we don't have in the folklore collection. So really we curate the content and they host it on the site. We have regular monthly meetings on technical and editorial issues. And if you go on to luganim.ie, if you go to the bottom of the page, you sometimes find here links to material, to folklore that can be found on the sister site, which is duchas.ie. So they're interoperable, basically, those sites. Just to give you some idea, most recent stats from late 2022, this is really the globally the access, the users, the profile of the users of the Dúchas website. Ireland is on top, naturally enough, almost 60%. That's down from 66% of the total. The United States has jumped in the past year from 12 to 16%. The UK is down from about 11% to almost 10%, slightly. India, interestingly, features high up there. There's a lot of Indian people coming to Ireland, and I think Dúchas is a source of information, cultural information for people arriving, coming to Ireland and settling here, or just spending a short deal of time. When you go onto the site, you can browse through the list of schools. You can filter them by counties. Here's an example of the how we present information. So the original image or page, manuscript page, the essay written by the pupil is center. The associated metadata is around it on to the right here, details of who the collector, and we consider the children were collectors in their own rights, folklore collectors. And the informant, this is a phrase that we've used since the 1930s, and we borrowed it from the Swedes in the 1930s. So as distinct from informer, it's an informant, somebody who provides information to you. So all the metadata is provided there. And then on the right-hand side in that box, you'll see transcriptions. So I'm coming to the actual mehel.ie. We use the word mehel. Mehel, of course, is a cooperative working party. It's a very old phrase, term in Ireland. And wherever a job of work needs to be done, people come together and they do it. And I think it's a very appropriate term to use. So users of the site were encouraged to register and to join up. Very, very simple. Basically, you provide a name and an email address. And you can see back in 2020, in early 2020, this was the stats as to how many pages had actually been transcribed. There's your login details, how to register and so forth. At its peak, about 6,000 people were registered as contributors, participants in the Mehel Dúchas project. So fairly detailed guidelines about what to do, not to interfere with anything, to type up what you see on the page, not what you think should be on the page. Some help files around the recognizing and understanding Gaelic script, because a great many of us now find it very difficult to read the old Gaelic script. And bear in mind that the folklore collection is bilingual. Certainly in the early days, in the 30s, 40s, up to the 50s, over 50% of what was being recorded by full-time and part-time collectors and so forth. Many of them, by the way, teachers, former existing and former teachers. Irish language featured most prominently, over 50%, as I say. Now, here's an example of a lovely piece written by, this is Inchin o Winnicon, Vincent Monaghan, A Funny Story, Scale Granur. Individual items within the volumes are listed here, so you can jump from item to item within the database. Here's an example. This is written by Michael Boylan from Malahide, County Dublin, North County Dublin, Damastown National School. And again, gives you a range here, the items on the list on the left-hand side of what was contained in that. Now, in 2020, with the onset of the pandemic, and we were all on lockdown, suddenly there was a huge spike in activity on the Mehel Dúchas. Not least here in UCD, because a lot of colleagues in UCD Library who were working from home actually logged on and started transcribing, registered and transcribed, and it gave a huge boost. I'll present you with a few stats very shortly, but these are some of the responses through social media to the whole Mehel and to Dúchas. And, you know, we were captive audience for many months, and with this fear that it could go on forever. But tasks like this work very, very well for people, you know, to engage in. Oh, the stats aren't coming up here properly. I hope the next slide does. But some of the comments are very interesting. It's also therapeutic to be part of a Mehel. A few thousand of us beavering away towards a common goal. It's not exactly like the original Mehel. There isn't a child running up to me and hopping onto a moving combine. To me, a bottle of harp and a bun. But still, what else would we all be doing with it? 10 minutes between childcare that will benefit the world while we are stuck at home. One of my favorite pandemic activities is to log on to Dúchas and participate in the Mehel. Okay, this is at least showing. If you can highlight here 2020, the green lines here. And so this is January, February, March. For some reason, they're not showing up on the slide here. But you can see the spike in the months from the end of March, April, May, and into June, and then it began to quieten down. And then there was another lockdown later that year, and again, there was another spike of activity. You can see that over the years, starting in, well, this only goes back to 2017, but currently, and this is the current one here, the maroon color here, we're averaging about 65,000 visits to Dúchas, to the site every year. So it's still extremely popular. And just to give you an idea, this is now the current state of play. When we started, there was about 58% of English language material transcribed. It's now 100% transcribed. And people are phoning up saying, have you nothing for me to transcribe? The Irish language material is slower. It's a bigger challenge for people. Where are we going now? The next leg of this, what we call the main manuscript collection. This is the work of the full-time and part-time collectors throughout Ireland, north and south. And this presents a particular challenge, especially the Irish language material. You can see there's a beautiful handwriting here. This is by the collector Tadhg Murphy in South Kerry. That is really challenging for people. And we're currently working with the University of Edinburgh, a joint project using Transcribus to recognize the handwriting of individual collectors. And we're getting about a 95, 96% success rate on that. And that using that data, that converted text, we will invite people who have a good understanding of Irish to then correct those those artificially generated transcriptions. So we'll be, rather than spreading out very wide, we'll be narrowing our focus to more specialist people. We will also be in coming years adding audio to the site and inviting people again to transcribe what they hear in the audio. Hopefully we will have technology that will recognize and be able to convert spoken language, and that's always difficult when dialect, especially Irish language dialect, is concerned. So the same routine will apply. All of the basic metadata has been extracted already, and this is all your, if I could run through this very quickly, the collector is Tadhg Murphy. He recorded these on the 1st of March 1936 using an Ediphone. This is one of these very early recording devices. And from a man called Podrigo Carroll, age 77, a farmer from Killigarteen. And actually he provides information about where he learned his information. So we have a very good information on the chain of transmission. And we would hope to apply this is my final slide. We would hope to apply this as well to photographs. And we're all ready. We host about 13,000 images representing everything from portraits to activities to features of the landscape and so on. And we will be inviting people to correct or add comments to those. So I'll pause at that. And thanks, Liz, thanks, Jane. And we may have some questions.
So we use the microphone so that the online audience can hear the questions as well. So are there any questions in the room? Like, I definitely have some questions. Like, I might use the privilege of asking questions. So how did both of you go about recruiting citizens to participate in these projects? I mean, I realize that maybe you're at slightly different stages and they're quite slightly different projects, but would you be able to talk a little bit about your, how you recruited people, how you try to retain people to have consistency of data to contribute, and how they felt about their role? Did it feel like very much a co-production, or was it that they were providing data? So how did you, keep them up to date with what they were doing?
I have the mic here. Yeah. Well, I think they're quite different. I really enjoyed your presentation. I suppose with me, my work has always been at very localized levels with communities. And number one, no matter what project I do, you find out who's the local agencies are, the local community development. And I suppose I think my project is a little bit different and we're at earlier stages. But what's vital for me is to get local buy-in. And through that, like, obviously there's benefits because they have a really good network. So but what it also does is if I can work with a local agency. So in my case, I'm working with a fairly big organization, Roscommon Leader Partnership, but then they are an umbrella group for every little village group, and those groups that do all the things we kind of don't think about, but when they happen. And by engaging with them and getting them to buy in, it also gives a project like mine legitimacy locally so that you can get buy-in. So I would always say work with people in partnership as opposed to kind of coming in as somebody from the outside trying to just extract information.
Yeah, we started from a healthy place insofar as Dúchas was very well established by 2020. And in fact, Mehel had been running for several years before that. Social media was a very important element, encouraging people, but advertising through the site itself and inviting people to contribute. Dúchas really reflects, I suppose, a community out there, a large community. In terms of place, people like to explore their place, their home place, and Dúchas, because of its very good geographic coverage, is a very attractive place to start. And so there's very much a shared principle at work here, the idea that this is material that was paid for by the state from the 1930s on, gathering this information and then putting it back out there for people to avail of. As I said earlier, we had up to 6,000 at one point in time registered with us. So it's very much on the basis of a shared approach, Liz, really, that it works. But you promote it by social media, and there's a community of transcribers, so sometimes they connect with one another. And it doesn't have to be tied to Ireland. You can see an awful lot of our people. There's a guy in Wyoming who's actually top of the class, you know, in terms of transcribing material. There's a woman contacted us from Australia. She left County Louth 30 odd years ago, and she said that in between knitting, while she was knitting in Australia, she found it very nice to go on in between and do a little bit of work on relating to her home place in North County Louth. So it's a two-way street, I guess.
And I suppose the question might possibly apply to you a little bit more, because, you know, they're shared a different way. But I suppose, how do you share the results afterwards with the citizens who have provided you with the information? And is that a way of sort of continuing a relationship with the communities that you're working with?
Yeah, no, thank you. It's a really good question, because it's something we're learning about. So on one hand, and maybe I didn't make it clear, like one of the outputs is we're developing a web-based platform, which will just look at, for now, County Roscommon. And we're going to be taking the learnings and try and make that accessible. I'm looking at Dom because that's a lot of his responsibility. But we'll be, you know, we're co-designing that web platform with the communities first and foremost. So that's one of the outputs. And I think if you have a product at the end, people can say, okay, there was something, because a lot, like people, and I know it's happening even with our own survey, people are being consulted on everything at the moment. And yet they don't feel, well, what have I done? Another survey? You know, where is it going? So there will be a product at the end. And in one sense, Roscommon's our test case, because my hope in the long run that we'll have something at a more national level. But then secondly, I suppose dissemination is having events as we go. So the World Cafe event that we'll be having in September, we're going to be inviting, while it will be a national conference, in the majority it will be people who we have met along the way, and they'll be getting to hear the results, but also feedback, because it's a participative event. So, and there will be another event. And we have the usual things like reports and all of that sort of stuff. But that's a good question that I need to think more about as well, in terms of how, because people need to know it's been of value.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you. My question is for Karen. What were the age range of your interviewees, and if you saw some difference between younger and older, because we know that younger are more familiarized with technologies and everything?
So for that set of interviews, we call them the high level. So they were that was an expert group. So in one sense, we were looking more at their role, their position, rather than gender or age, even though there was a mix. And actually, age, I hadn't thought of it, but when I think of it, because I'm visualizing the interviewees, age didn't seem to play a part, in the sense that it was more people's opinions were more coming from their own, where their expertise were. So if they were, I'm trying not to be too identifiable, but if they were maybe a more top-down organization that dealt with data, they were more likely to be, it's all fine. If they were working, regardless of gender and age, if they were more likely to work at local level with rural communities, they were identifying some of the issues with all communities accessing data. The survey that we have ready to go is going to account for age and all of those. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see what we get back there. Thanks.
From bottom down survey, your County Roscommon.
Yes.
Locked into the survey that is done by Dukas, all digitalized, all listed on County Roscommon. Can you put that in chronological order so that you get a history of the whole folklore of County Roscommon only? Now, I don't know if other places outside County Roscommon will talk about County Roscommon. So you get the chronology down, locking in the local people into the situation. and you get the past history in place name lore, in folklore, in whatever else they've done on their site. All done. So you just did lines of the cross,
Yeah.
I presume, I don't know. Then each community out there in rural, what's the best economic rural activity in Roscommon? Is it grain? Is it horses? Is it cattle? Is it sheep? What are you into? What are they into? And if you find out what they're interested in, then they lock into that. And accordingly, what do they need? What's their need digitally for them on that side of things? And hence, the whole thing just balloons.
Have you written all that down?
Thank you.
Thank you. I have to say, when Críostóir was talking, I was like, I wonder, is there any way of bringing this into what we're doing? Because I've been in a lot of public consultations in the last few weeks, because everyone's doing their local economic and community plans, and people talk about heritage and history and folklore so much. Even if they're talking about, we need a better rail service, we need more jobs, they constantly also talk about what you're looking at. So there's learning there, but we might, and I think all the nature and environment elements there, there is such an innate knowledge that people know, I think, what's needed, but it's about how we listen to them. I talk to you again.
Do you have anything to add, Críostóir?
Maybe just to say that, I mean, heritage, cultural history, including place name lore and so on, and that's really rooted in the place. Yeah. And it's considered an asset, a local resource by people, and it's one that they cherish. And it helps establish a meaningful connection with place. I think it feeds in nicely into that.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah.
Hi, relating to that perhaps is new phases of data gathering, but in a sort of democratized way. I come from an archaeological background, and classically an archaeologist would be dispatched to walk through a field on a given date and a given place and a given time. And that's the record for the next 40 years till the next archaeologist shows up. Now, clearly there are other ways we can do that, and democratizing the gathering of information, the capture, the front end. I don't think archaeology is cracked yet. I'm wondering whether, we could have a schools collection for the 21st century, something on a digital platform, or whether other disciplines have a similar thing where you actually try and create a data structure, and then you get the level of engagement. And it doesn't all have to be perfect, and it doesn't all have to be sorted. With respect, it's taken nearly a century to get the schools collection up, and that's fine. You can gather it and take time to process and digest, but it can be there. I do worry about the instantaneous gratification issue, which I have a problem with as well, where people want immediate results and statistics out of stuff. And sometimes the data is its own virtue. If it's calmly collected, of course, you can draw from it. So in terms of, like, for example, in the Roscommon group, you seem to be dealing with a lot of groups, they're community groups, development groups. How do you crack that down to the individual level and give them a way of doing it? So that you don't have, as the question was, people of a particular educational background, confidence, social background, status, those kind of things. So that's kind of space I'm kind of interested in, is getting down to that, empowering the individual, but getting representative engagement, but also allowing the data to be equitably collected. Is there any thoughts on that?
No, representative engagement is one of the biggest challenges in local development, in any because even with the current round of consultations, it's the same people turning up, and there's the unheard voices, and it's one of the biggest challenges. And it's about, and I suppose opening up data to try and include people is one way of doing it, but it has to be multi-pronged. But I think it's an issue across the board. I haven't solved it yet.
Just before Críostóir responds, I would like to say that we have an Earth Institute initiative that's piloting at the moment that sort of responds to that. So it's called the Earth Institute Citizens Observatory, and it's about providing ArcGIS templates for projects so that they can gather citizen data. And it's building on the CCAT project, which is the Coastal Communities Acting Together project, with Phil Crow and Chiara Coco, who kindly provided the templates. And one of their things were that they were digital. They had lots of events planned, and then lockdown happened, So some of the stuff had to go virtual, but they also brought laptop computers and had organized events in the communities for people, so that people who wouldn't necessarily have either access to the technology or the digital skills or the confidence to, fill in a survey were assisted at these events in order to be able to make sure that the data that they were getting were representative of the wider community and not just the people who turn up to all, the same kind of consultations. So, we're continuing to pilot this. So if anyone's interested, very happy to have a conversation about supporting projects in this area.
Just add to that, perhaps, Conor, just to say that organising something comparable to the schools collection would be a monstrous task today. But the technology is around now, so that a lot of very meaningful data can be gathered if you use the technology, mobile phones or whatever, in that way. But you'd have to be very carefully structured. It would have to be a joint, interagency really approach to gathering, to doing, if you like, audits of the condition of the landscape and the protection of monuments, and so on. But there is certainly considerable scope. Very challenging to do that, but it's already happening to some degree in terms of the place names, because you have a lot of local groups gathering micro place names now, and they're feeding that in directly into Luganum and the place names database. Yeah.
Are there any other questions, or we'll? Oh.
I have a question for Críostóir, and it's in relation to in 1937 when they were developing the headings. I mean, I've used Dukas and it appears to be very comprehensive in what it can produce for me. But how did they develop those headings at the time? How did they pick the subject headings for the kids to write about?
Yeah. Good question, Dominic. Those headings, about 50 odd headings, were really starting points for the school children, but they represent really a subset of the topics, the subjects being investigated at the time by the full-time and part-time folklore collectors. And that's very, very broad. If you go to the Handbook of Irish Folklore, published in 1942, that's used globally now because it had 700 pages of questions about every conceivable aspect of human life, culture, natural history, our understanding of the world. So the Commission were careful in choosing those topics that might appeal mostly to children, and that includes, things that are surprising, things that are marvels, and that could be in the form of the verbal arts, but also local legends and stories connected with place, similar to the old Din Shanachas, the lore of places, or the place name lore of early Ireland, where you have a story explaining the context or the background of something. So that would have appealed to children, and local monuments that appeal very strongly. Birds, bird life and so on, that, but lore of herbs and so on like that. So a subset of the broader range of topics being investigated by folklore collectors and geared towards school children. I think that's the best way of putting it.
Thanks. So I think that's all the questions we have, but I just wanted to say a big thank you to Karen and Críostóir for coming along, and to everyone here in the audience. And also to say that myself and Jane are, delighted that these events happen. I will have news of our forthcoming event going up on our website and across our mailing list. And if any of you are interested in hearing more, we have our website, we have the Citizen Science Library Guide, which Jane manages, and we also have a mailing list which we would encourage people to sign up to find out more. So thank you very much.